What if the thing that made some of the most dangerous people in history wasn't violence? What if it wasn't a broken home or abuse or poverty? What if it was something quieter? Something you couldn't see, couldn't point to, couldn't prove? What if the most dangerous thing anyone ever did to them was nothing at all? If you're new here, welcome. If you've been watching for a while, good to have you back. This channel tells stories that hit home. Stories that make you think after the screen goes dark. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read them. And if no one's told you to subscribe yet, now's a good time. There's a version of this story most people already know. The version that true crime podcasts built their audiences on. The version that shows like Mindhunter packaged into something easy to consume. In that version, the monster has a blueprint. He wet the bed past a certain age. He lit fires. He hurt animals. His father beat him. His mother was cold and cruel or completely absent. He came from the wrong neighborhood, the wrong school, the wrong zip code. That's the story. That's what we've been told. It's a story that makes sense. That's why it's stuck. We are creatures who need causation. We need to believe that darkness has a clear origin point. If we can identify the variables, we can control the outcome. If we know what creates a monster, we can stop one from being made. It's a comforting logic. It just isn't entirely accurate. Ted Bundy grew up in a middle-class home. He was described by neighbors as charming, well-mannered, and bright. His grandfather was strict and volatile, but Bundy, by most accounts, was not systematically beaten. John Wayne Gacy ran a business. He managed employees, hosted neighborhood barbecues, dressed as a clown to entertain sick children at hospitals. His neighbors didn't see it. His co-workers didn't see it. BTK Dennis Rader was a church president. He had a family, a job, a community standing. None of them fit the neat blueprint perfectly. And that's when researchers, not screenwriters, not podcast hosts, started asking harder questions. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, beginning in the late 1970s, conducted a landmark series of interviews with convicted serial killers. 36 men. Detailed, recorded, methodical. They were looking for the pattern. And they found one, but it wasn't the one anyone expected. The pattern wasn't violence. It wasn't poverty. It wasn't even abuse in the way most people define it. The pattern, the single most consistent thread across the majority of these men's childhoods, was emotional neglect. Chronic, pervasive, and almost entirely invisible. Not being struck, not being screamed at, simply not being seen. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what a child actually needs in the first years of life. Not just food, not just shelter. A child needs to be mirrored. They need to look at a face, a parent's face, a caregiver's face, and see themselves reflected back. They need to cry and have someone respond. They need to laugh and see someone laugh with them. They need to feel that their internal world, their fear, their joy, their hunger, their confusion, registers with another human being. That process has a name. It's called secure attachment, and it is not optional. Think of it this way. A plant that gets stepped on is damaged. You can see the damage. You can point to where it broke. But a plant that simply never gets water, it doesn't break dramatically. It just slowly stops becoming what it was supposed to be. The damage is in the absence, and absence leaves no bruises. When the researchers went back through the interview transcripts, when they listened to these men describe their own childhoods, a language kept appearing, a vocabulary of emptiness. Nobody cared what I thought. I learned not to bother saying anything. I felt like furniture. I didn't think anyone would notice if I disappeared. These weren't men describing beatings. They were describing something that looked, from the outside, like an ordinary childhood. But from the inside, it was a house with no one home. There is a term psychologists use for children who grow up this way, the invisible child. Not invisible in the literal sense. They went to school. They sat at dinner tables. They existed in photographs. But their inner life, their fears, their questions, their needs, was met with consistent, quiet indifference. No one asked how they felt. No one noticed when something was wrong. No one sat down and said, "Tell me what's going on inside you." And over time, those children stopped expecting anyone to. What happens neurologically when attachment fails is not abstract. It is physical. The developing brain of an infant and toddler is sculpted by interaction. Every responsive moment, every time a caregiver answers a cry, mirrors an expression, engages with curiosity, lays down neural pathways. Those pathways become the architecture of empathy, the biological infrastructure that allows a person to recognize that other people have inner lives, that other people feel things, that other people are real in the way you are real. When those moments are consistently absent, that architecture doesn't fully form. This is not a death sentence. That point matters and it will come back. But in the absence of that early mirroring, in the absence of a face that reflects you back, some children begin to construct the world differently. They don't learn to locate themselves in relation to others. They learn, instead, to locate others in relation to themselves. People become objects in their environment. Obstacles or tools or scenery, but not subjects, not beings with their own interior weather. Edmund Kemper spoke about this in clinical detail during his interviews. He described watching his mother interact with others, warmly, openly, with interest, in ways she never directed at him. He said he spent years observing people as though from behind glass, present in the room but sealed off from it. He described developing what he called a fantasy life as a substitute for connection, a world inside his head that was richer and more responsive than anything outside it. That inner world, over years, curdled into something he would eventually act on. Jeffrey Dahmer described a childhood defined not by violence but by withdrawal. His parents' marriage was visibly deteriorating throughout his early years. He later said that he felt, from a young age, that his emotional needs were a burden to the people around him. He stopped expressing them. He retreated. He began dismembering roadkill in the woods behind his house, not out of rage, investigators would later note, but out of a detached, clinical fascination. The interior world had already started separating from ordinary human reference points. It would be wrong to suggest that emotional neglect is the sole variable. Researchers are careful about that. There are other factors: genetic predispositions, neurological anomalies, later life triggers, substance abuse, head trauma in some cases. The picture is never a single line drawn from childhood to catastrophe. But across the body of research, emotional neglect appears as the most consistent soil. Not the only ingredient, but the ground in which the others took root. And here is the part that matters most. The part that gets lost in the way we tell these stories. Emotional neglect is not rare. It is not confined to the households that produce killers. It is epidemic. It exists in homes that look functional. In homes with 2 parents, regular meals, and college funds. It exists wherever a child's emotional experience is consistently minimized, dismissed, or simply ignored. "You're fine. Stop being so sensitive. I don't have time for this right now." Said once, those phrases mean nothing. Said across a decade, they become the architecture of a life. Society has built systems to detect physical abuse. Mandatory reporting laws. Teachers trained to look for bruises. Medical professionals who know what broken bones look like on an X-ray. We are not perfect at catching it, but we have a language for it. We have no equivalent system for detecting emotional absence. There is no bruise, no fracture, no visible marker. Just a child who has quietly learned that their inner world is not worth anyone's attention, and so they stop offering it. The researchers who spent decades studying these cases did not come away with simple answers. They came away with uncomfortable ones. The question was never only what went wrong in that specific household. The deeper question was, how many households have the same quiet problem and we simply haven't looked? How many children are sitting right now in clean, unbruised, invisible pain? That question doesn't have a clean answer, but it is the right question to be asking. Take a minute before we go further. If this story is making you think, if it's the kind of content you want more of, subscribe. Takes 3 seconds and it means this work keeps getting made. There is a version of this conversation that ends at the darkness, that catalogs the damage, names the killers, and leaves the viewer sitting in the discomfort without anywhere to go. This is not that version. Because the research that uncovered the pattern also uncovered something else. Something that matters more. The vast majority of children who experience emotional neglect do not become violent. That sentence needs to stay on the screen long enough to settle. Because the story of early childhood neglect is not only, and not even primarily, a story about criminality. It is a story about what human beings need to become fully human. And the evidence shows that those needs, when unmet early, can be partially addressed by what comes after. The brain is more plastic than we once believed. The window is not as narrow as the early research suggested. Resilience is not magic. It is not an innate quality some children simply have and others don't. Resilience, researchers found, is almost always traceable to a specific source. One person, sometimes just one, a grandmother, a teacher, a coach who stayed after practice to ask how things were going at home, a neighbor who fed them dinner and asked about their day and meant it, one adult who looked at that child and said, with their presence, if not their words, you are worth paying attention to. There is documented research on what that one relationship does to outcomes. Children who experienced neglect but had at least one stable, responsive attachment figure showed significantly different trajectories. Lower rates of antisocial behavior, greater capacity for emotional regulation, a measurably higher ability to recognize and respond to the emotions of others. One person. That is not a small finding. That is the whole argument. Empathy is not a personality trait you are born with fully formed. It is a learned skill. It is taught, without anyone calling it a lesson, in the thousands of small moments when a caregiver responds to a child's emotional signal. You cry and someone comes. You are frightened and someone names the fear. You are excited and someone shares the excitement. Each of those moments is a rehearsal, a practice run at the fundamental human skill of recognizing that another person's experience is real and matters. Without enough rehearsals, the performance never comes naturally. Dennis Rader, BTK, described in Psychological Evaluations a childhood in which he was not mistreated in any way that would register on a standard checklist. His parents were present. The family was intact. But evaluators who studied his early development noted a consistent pattern of emotional unavailability from his primary caregivers. Not cruelty, unavailability. He described learning to manage his inner life entirely alone. No one asked. He stopped offering. The fantasy world he constructed in that solitude, investigators would later say, was where the violence was first rehearsed, long before it was enacted. What the researchers kept returning to was the role of what they called internal narrative. Every person constructs a story about who they are and how the world works. That story is built earliest and most durably in childhood. For children with secure attachment, that story tends to include other people as meaningful participants. For the invisible child, the child who never received consistent mirroring, that story gets written differently. Other people are backdrop. The self is the only real thing, and a world in which only the self is real is a world without limits. There was a boy. He was not famous. His name is not in any database. He grew up in a house that looked normal from the outside. Father worked. Mother was home. No one hit him. No one screamed. But no one asked him questions. No one sat with him when he was afraid. No one noticed when he started pulling away from other kids at school. By the time he was 12, a teacher noticed. Not because something was wrong in the obvious sense, because something was missing. That teacher referred him to a school counselor. The counselor used a specific framework, not to diagnose, not to label, but to give the boy language for what he had been carrying without words. Sessions once a week. Simple questions. How did that feel? What did you need in that moment? Do you think that person was trying to hurt you? Or do you think they were just not paying attention? 18 months later, his teacher described a different child. Not fixed, not transformed overnight, but present, connected, capable of something he hadn't been before, of imagining that other people had their own interior weather. That story is not exceptional. It is repeatable. Programs built around early emotional intervention, in schools, in pediatric offices, in community centers, have documented similar outcomes across thousands of cases. The intervention doesn't have to be clinical. It doesn't require a specialist in every room. It requires adults who understand that a child's emotional life is not secondary to their development. It is their development. The funding gap is real and it is significant. Programs addressing physical abuse and neglect receive a fraction of the resources directed at other childhood interventions. In most school systems, the ratio of counselors to students remains far outside the range recommended by mental health professionals. Pediatric screenings routinely check physical development milestones. Emotional development screenings are inconsistent at best, absent at worst. The infrastructure for catching the invisible wound simply does not exist at the scale the problem demands. Organizations working in this space, the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, local trauma-informed care initiatives, have produced clear evidence of what works. Early home visiting programs, parent-child interaction therapy, trauma-informed school models that train every staff member, not just counselors, to recognize the signs of emotional dysregulation and respond without punishment. The evidence exists. The gap is between what the evidence shows and what gets funded. We keep looking for the monster in the making. We scan for warning signs. We look for the violence, the red flags, the behavior that lets us say, "There it is, that's the one to watch." And sometimes those signs appear, but the research points somewhere harder, somewhere we haven't built systems to look. The absence of a responsive face in the first years of life does not announce itself. It just quietly shapes what a person becomes capable of feeling for another human being. There is grief in this if you sit with it, not the grief of a horror story, the quieter kind, the grief of imagining how many children right now are sitting in rooms where no one asks, where no one sits down and says, "What's happening inside you?" Where the only message the environment delivers, day after day, is, "Your inner world is not worth anyone's time." And those children adapt. They become functional. They learn to manage. Some of them grow up and make sure their own children never feel that way. And some of them don't. The children who broke that cycle, the ones who researchers tracked across decades, they had one thing in common. Not a perfect childhood. Not professional therapy in every case. Not an absence of hardship. They had one relationship in which they were fully seen. One adult whose attention was real. One person who asked the question and waited for the answer. That is the intervention. That is the research finding stripped to its core. You do not have to be a specialist. You have to be present. Every child needs to feel like they matter. That is not a soft idea dressed up in the language of feelings. It is a neurological requirement. It is the precondition for empathy. It is the foundation on which the capacity to recognize another person's humanity is built. When it is withheld, not through violence, not through cruelty, but through simple, sustained absence, something in the developing brain learns to manage without it. And what fills that space is not always something the world outside will recognize as dangerous until it is far too late. The most dangerous thing we can do to a child is nothing at all. That sentence sits differently now than it did at the beginning of this story. It is not a slogan. It is a research finding that took decades to assemble. It is the testimony of men who described their childhoods in the vocabulary of emptiness. It is the outcome data of programs that changed trajectories with presence and attention. It is the observation of teachers, counselors, and researchers who looked at children no one else was looking at and changed what those children were capable of becoming. The children in your life right now, the ones you see at school pickup, across the dinner table, at practice, in your classroom, in your family, some of them are waiting for the question. Not a clinical question, not a formal check-in, just, "How are you doing?" And then staying in the room for the answer. That is not a small thing. According to the data, it might be the most important thing any of us ever does. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. Like the video, leave a comment. Tell us what hit hardest. Share it with someone who works with children, raises children, or simply thinks about what kind of world we're building. This channel will keep making stories that matter. Stay connected. We'll see you in the next one.